I must add one little thing, which is that I happen to be a Pashtun, and which is this ethnic group, people that I'm going to talk about, and I've written a book. So that's the Pashtun question is the title of my book, which was published 2 years ago. Actually, growing up in Pakistan, I always was struck by the idea and the thing that we were a society that was caught up in war. When I was growing up in Waziristan, we had Afghan refugees in where we are. So it's all of Pashtuns, and that's what we are probably going to discuss a lot today, are divided between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this division is not neat and clean that you can say this part of Pashtuns are Pakistani Pashtuns, or these are Afghan Pashtuns or something. By the way, Afghan means Pashtun. This was one of the identities of Pashtuns. Because the tribes straddle the border from north, Safi and Mamund and Mohmand, to Kakhar and Achakzi in the south. All the major Pashtun tribes straddle the Durand line, which is the 19th century colonial border that divides the two countries right there. This red line in the middle, right there. This is a lot of where today's conflicts are. So there are two sayings in Pashto which I think will absolutely encapsulate what I'm going to say today. Pashto is the language of the Pashtuns, and Indo-European or Indo-Iranian language. One is that Marshwa or Padhamshwa, which means that I'm being killed, or I'm the victim, but I'm also defeated, or my narrative is defeated. And the reason for that is that Pashtuns have been, at least, I mean, since the history, I won't go glorify the historic things, but for the known history, they are quite central to Asia and this region, which has been the center of a lot of human civilization since the Indus civilization. But a lot of their history, or what has been written about them, is written by outsiders, particularly when it comes to modern writings that relate to the situation on ground today. The Pashtuns, in Pashto language, we have great poetry. Khushal Khan Khatak was a 17th century Pashtun poet, and I think a contemporary of, many European poets, or his poetry is comparable to anybody in the world, but he is not known to the outside world. And of course, he wrote in Pashto, so mostly, and so whatever he wrote is limited to Pashtuns. And then the other proverb or Pashto saying that I'm going to say is that Kagar Chagdai Pasarye Larshta. We are mountain people, we have tall mountains. And there is a saying in our villages that if the mountain is tall, there is a path on top of it. So on top of every tall mountain, there is a path. So we are a people who are under a lot of problems. There are 50 million Pashtuns today in the world, divided between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Some 15 million, or nearly half of Afghan population is Pashtuns. And then another 35 million in Pakistan. This is the Pashtun division. This is actually the society on the map. This is all the major tribes and the smaller tribes, the main divisions of Pashtuns in Afghanistan. You can see that a lot of these tribes are across the border, Achakzai, Nurzai, the Wazir, Masid, and then onwards to Shinwaris and Mamunds. So they are also one of, I think, since, especially now with the war on terror and this thing, one of the people who have been stereotyped, stigmatized. It's the Pashtuns who are the worst victim of the violence, both in Pakistan and Afghanistan today. And unfortunately, the narrative that's being written about them is not written by themselves, it's written by outsider, and a lot of it is plainly wrong. My effort was to move away from this narrative of victimhood. So what I did with my book and my research was that I did the best that I can with research, and of course, unlike natural sciences, social sciences are not an exact science. But I did my best to look at this from a very neutral perspective, but an informed perspective, a perspective that is informed by the people who are the worst victims of what is happening there. So the first question, obvious question is, what is the Pashtun question, and how it originated, and why it's relevant today, and why do we need to address it? The Pashtun question is basically the division of Pashtuns between two states that have either failed or are failing or were failing. Both of these states have not absorbed them. And then both of these states, even today, are basically enemies of each other. Afghanistan does not recognize the Durand Line as international border. The Afghans accuse Pakistan as whatever it's been doing in Afghanistan for the past 30, 40 years as part of some kind of a grand scheme to destabilize Afghanistan to the extent that Pakistan can impose a government that it likes on Afghanistan. So the Pashtun question begins with, there was an Afghan empire when the British were conquering India in, say, 18th century, from the south, from Calcutta onwards, from Bengal. The Afghans had an empire in northern India, in what is today's Afghanistan and Pakistan. It was called the Durrani Empire. Durrani is, as you can see, is one of the tribal confederacies of Pashtuns in southwestern Afghanistan. So they encountered by mid-19th century the Pashtuns, or the Afghan Empire, and they were defeated, as everybody knows in this room, I think, in the first Anglo-Afghan War, which was one of the biggest defeat to the British Empire. It was not directly to the British Empire, it was the East India Company, but the company was then the main imperial power in India. And then, of course, again, there were battles in the Second World War that the British were defeated in, and then there was the famous Battle of Maiwand, and then there was the Third Anglo-Afghan War, 1919. So there was an evolution of British security thinking for how to secure their northern borders. The British had an idea called the frontier. By the way, the name of one of the Pashtun provinces in Pakistan used to be the Northwest Frontier Province of Pakistan. Now it's being renamed, thankfully, as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But until 2010, it was called the Northwest Frontier Province of Pakistan, because for the British, frontier was something that was not static, that was not a border, that was supposed to move forward, because we had an empire, and the empire could only survive if it grew, if it expanded. So by mid-18th century, the British Empire was in active conflict with Afghans, and of course Pashtuns are the largest ethnic group or the biggest part of Afghans, and with Pashtun Durrani dynasty. When they were first defeated in the first Anglo-Afghan War, they tried to come up with more smarter ways of controlling this tribal society, the Pashtuns. By early 20th, late 19th century, they created something called the threefold frontier. So there was a border in South Asia, in India, which has three tiers. The first one was what was the settled districts of Punjab and all. This was like India proper. Then there is this river Indus which bisects Pakistan. So there were some districts of this part which were first they were in Punjab, and then they extended later to an NWFP, which they called them in early 20th century. They called them settled district, which means that they were municipal laws. They were under regular government administration. people were supposed to tax them. So to separate these Pashtun regions from those in Afghanistan that were ruled by the king or a suzerain king, they created something called the tribal territories, FATA, where I come from. FATA is federally administered tribal area, which evolved later, but the reason for this thing was to kind of create an insulation, the kind of insulation that we have today to protect us from heat and cold in our houses. They had this kind of insulation to protect their empire from the influences in this part of territory and beyond that in Russia, because they were also in competition by mid-19th century with Russia, something called the Great Game. And then they created what was the state of, or the kingdom of Afghanistan, but it was a suzerain country until early 20th century. And the British paid, since Amir Abdur Rahman Khan, particularly Amir Abdur Rahman, they paid most of the money, the budget. And it was a suzerain in the sense that Afghanistan had no control over its foreign policy. So they could not establish independent relationships with other powers. And this was, again, another layer of insulation to protect the Indian Empire, the British Indian Empire, from the bad influences. So what happened was that the worst victim of this kind of imperial design was this society living here, the Pashtun society. And it prevented them from progressing, it prevented them from creating a nation state, it prevented them from, for example, joining the great Indian independence movement. We had in early 19th century a big movement here, which was Abdul Ghaffar Khan, a reformist, non-violent leader, who mobilized in 1920s 100,000 people. 100,000 Pashtuns swore allegiance to him, and they were non-violent soldiers of God, and they were, of course, independent fighters. But it's for a tribal society and a society that's closely associated with violence. It was a remarkable achievement for this reformer, who was also into modern education, who for the first time opened independent schools, and first thing he did in these schools was send his soldier. And then we had a reformist king in Afghanistan in that time, King Amanullah, who wanted to modernize Afghanistan, who in 1920s toured Europe. His idea was to create something like secular Turkey in Afghanistan. But because the British had created this insulation of tribal areas, these two movements never met or didn't join. So these things happened. Now, at the time of Pakistan independence, there was a referendum in northwest, in this part of Pakistan, then India, called the northwest, this territory, northwest frontier. There was a nominal jirga here, and this referendum had only two choices. One was that you join India, one was that you join Pakistan. So, of course, there are a lot of talk about this referendum being rigged and stuff, but the referendum voted in favor of joining Pakistan. And then, of course, this part of Pashtun territories, they were part of what they call British Balochistan, so one jirga decided to accede to Pakistan or something like that. So with the creation of Pakistan, Afghanistan had now a neighbor which had Islamic legitimacy, because Pakistan was created in the name of Islam. It had a majority of what to many Afghan rulers was majority of their people and majority of their land. If you look at Afghan literature, Khushal Khan and Rahman, they are still Afghan national heroes. And they are from this part, they are from Pakhtunkhwa. So this is like, in a way, a completely artificial division, and this division kind of created a conflict between two Muslim countries called Afghanistan, Pakistan today. Afghanistan, to be very honest, didn't recognize Pakistan initially, but then in a few months they recognized Pakistan. They opposed Pakistan's membership of the United Nations, but they then agreed to it. and ever since then Afghanistan and Pakistan have diplomatic relations. The Pashtunistan thing, but Afghanistan supported the right of self-determination of Pashtuns. There was something called Pashtunistan. But the Pashtuns were also kind of, again, part of a much larger global competition in the mid-20th century, which was called the Cold War. In the Cold War, this state first attempted neutrality, but eventually it moved closer to Soviet Union, and this state, Pakistan, from the beginning became a member of anti-communist Western blocs, CETO, CENTO, everything else. Now, in this situation, these tribal areas remain frozen. There is a law called the Frontier Crimes Regulations. It's still the law of the land in tribal areas. And it's the most inhumane, discriminatory law on the book, one of the most inhumane and discriminatory laws on the book in the world today. It empowers the government or the government representative in a tribal district to order collective punishment, to enforce collective punishment. So for example, if one member of one tribe, for example, Wazir or Masih, do something wrong, the entire tribe is punished for that wrong. Like for example, we had an insurgency in Pakistan, and the entire Masih or Masood tribe is displaced now, most of them, or at least 60–70%, and they cannot even travel back on a government road here because the government said no, because there were Taliban members among your tribe, so you're not welcome, you can't use this government road. They cannot go back to their homes and properties. Pakistan did very little to integrate these people. They didn't. The idea of Pakistan when it emerged was that you need to accept it as a Muslim country. But what do you mean by Muslim country? Because Pashtuns have been Muslim for 1,000 years. They are largely, it was the Pashtun empires largely, partly responsible for bringing Islam to the Indian subcontinent. So they, but they used kind of these authoritarian means or manipulating the system in a way that it won't allow these communities or ethnic groups. For example, in Pakistan, one of the first things, Pakistan became a military dictatorship early on in its history. Nearly 10 years after independence in 1958, there was the first martial law, and since then we have 4 martial laws. Pakistan has been under military dictatorship for nearly, I think, 40 years, and it has been a civilian rule a lot less, and the civilian rule is inherently unstable because the politicians do not have the power and control over policies, and that still is the thing that haunts Pakistan. So in this kind of situation, one thing that I must mention is that Afghanistan never backstabbed Pakistan. It's very important to note. In 1965, in the 1965 war between India and Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Afghan monarchy, Zahir Shah was the king, and there was a democratic government under him. They didn't allow India to do anything to Pakistan from Afghanistan, and in fact they helped, by some accounts, Pakistani Air Force planes to be sheltered in Afghanistan. In 1971, when Pakistan lost one part of its country, the majority of Pakistanis left what is Pakistan and they became Bangladesh, they again, Afghanistan didn't backstab Pakistan. But with changing geopolitics, earlier I had a lecture in one of the classes, Ander's class, and we talked about the Islamist movement in Afghanistan, Islam and politics, and Islam and the Afghan conflict. So in the 60s, because Afghanistan couldn't become a pro-Western country, it gradually moved towards Soviet Union, and in 1960 there was a communist movement emerged. Again, what drove the communist movement, or part of the communist movement, was this whole Pashtun question, because they wanted the Pashtuns to, in their view, progress and be united. And this eventually led to 2 coups in Afghanistan. The first one was in 1973 by somebody called Sardar Muhammad Dawood. He was the king and the king's cousin and former prime minister, and he launched a bloodless coup against the king, Zahir Shah, with the help of some communist officers who were part of the Parcham faction of the Communist Party. And later on in 1978, Dawood was killed by the Khalq, or more radical part of the Communist Party. And this was a bloody coup because he and his extended family was killed. So this Soviet invasion of 1979 started after 1978, when the Soviet, the communist coup. There was a lot of factional infighting between the communist factions. There was, of course, the big fighting between the Khalq and Parcham, but there were a lot of leadership differences and a lot of jealousies within those factions, particularly among Khalqis. And essentially, within 1 year, Amin sidelined his mentor and leader of the so-called revolution, Tarakai, and he was later on killed. And then Amin was deposed by the direct Soviet invasion on Christmas Eve, 1979. And this time, the Soviet invasion, before the Soviet invasion, the Afghan communists, of course, had engaged in a lot of brutalities. They had essentially provoked a rebellion by going against trying to implement radical reform after a military coup. It was a military coup that they did in April 1978, but they called it a revolution. It was never a revolution. Afghanistan was, I think somewhere in Karl Marx or Engels, in their writings, they have said that Afghanistan is one of the last societies where there will be a communist revolution because there is no industry. It's a tribal society. But these political factions, they launched a coup, and the result was a lot of infighting, instability, and eventually a Soviet invasion. And with the Soviet invasion, which provoked an Islamist rebellion. And with this Islamist rebellion, gave Pakistan a golden opportunity to manipulate or play a much bigger role, a role that it would have never imagined in Afghan politics. Because by early 1980s, you had millions of Afghans, refugees in Pakistan. You had the entire leadership of the Afghanistan Islamist movement living in these regions of Pakistan. And they were supported with arms and everything by United States, Western Europe, Saudi Arabia was matching United States $1 for $1. So there was, the communist world was with the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, or the Afghan communist regime, and the rest of the world, or anti-communist bloc, was with Pakistan. And this again wreaked havoc on the Pashtuns. They were the worst victims of what happened then, because they were killing each other, because Mujahideen leadership was Pashtuns, but they were, the communist leaders was also Pashtuns. And this war became kind of a global war. And this also gave birth to what we now know as international terrorism or whatever, done by groups like Al-Qaeda. Because the Arab radicals, for the first time, in the war against the Soviet Union, they gained this experience, the organizational skill, they networked. Al-Qaeda means the base, which is basically a network, during this war against the Soviet Union. And the worst victims were, of course, the Pashtun civilians. And one of the other tragedies that happened was that while they were victims, they were also blamed for what was happening in them by calling them wild tribes and these kind of stereotypes. So since that time, there has been, as we speak today, there has been no successful peace-building effort. While the world has invested a lot of money, like the Mujahideen received, I mean, their estimates, but billions of dollars from the West. There was very little, and Anders spent his career doing this, there's very little investment in peace building, in rebuilding the society, because you had the kind of migration that the Pashtuns have endured, displacement and migration. It's mind-boggling. You will find if you go to Dubai, every second taxi driver will be a Pashtun. Why are they taxi drivers in Dubai? Because there is no economic opportunity in their homeland. The conflict has rendered them impoverished, and that's why Karachi in the past 30, 40 years, the port city of, main port city of Pakistan, has become, right here, I can show you, it has become the biggest Pashtun city in the world. It's Pakistan's biggest city, but it's also become the biggest Pashtun city because of this migration. So by the end of Soviet occupation in 1988, again, there was no serious effort at peace building. I mean, peace building in this kind of society needs generations. It needs sustained international engagement. And what the international community did was that they abandoned Afghanistan. They had invested a lot of money in making the war against Soviet Union successful, but after the withdrawal of Soviet Union, they just walked away. And of course, Pakistan saw this thing through the lens of its geostrategic interest, because we must remember that in Pakistan there was a military dictatorship, and the military dictatorship saw this as a struggle to safeguard Pakistan. First, I mean, there is a famous quote by Pakistani military dictator Ziaul Haq in the 1980s, and the quote is something like that: if the Afghan Mujahideen do not succeed, the Soviet Union will basically annihilate Pakistan, because the Pakistani thinking was that the Soviet war in Afghanistan was motivated by their effort to reach through the warm waters. So by 1988, when the first cycle of what we now know as the Afghan war was concluding, there was no robust international effort to end this conflict, to go for a comprehensive settlement in this region, which would have required some kind of settlement between Pakistan and Afghanistan. There was a Geneva Accord, for example, which ended the Soviet occupation, but even after the Geneva Accords, the Soviet bloc kept on pouring money and weapons to the Afghan communist government, and it sustained for 3 more years until 1992. It actually outlasted the Soviet Union itself. And then, on the other side, the Western backers of Pakistan and the Mujahideen, they kept on pouring money and weapons into Mujahideen. And there was a famous battle, the Battle of Jalalabad in 1989, which was like the worst disaster, because I think 15 to 20,000 combatants and as many non-combatants died in that conflict. Completely useless war, but nobody paid attention. One of the only leaders who paid some attention to this was the Afghan communist, ironically, the Afghan communist president, Dr. Najibullah. He came up with a peace plan. He agreed to leave his power according to the this UN-sponsored plan. In 1992, he relinquished plan. He not only provoked a kind of a rebellion within his party cadres, but the Mujahideen Pakistan, nobody accepted it from their heart. So one part of the plan was implemented, which was his resignation. The rest was, everybody forgot about the rest. So then by after 1992, we had nearly complete, this is one of the famous places in downtown Kabul, and this was again rebuilt, but this was completely destroyed. Like, there was no standing unders. So there was no standing building in this whole region, in this whole part of the city. There were neighborhoods of neighborhoods, and this was the worst part of the Afghan civil war. The civil war continued, and it still in some ways continues. But in 1994, a new group of fundamentalist extremists emerged called the Taliban. Now, the Taliban were different, somewhat different from the other Afghan groups, because they were not a group that was motivated, they were not kind of a tribal network. They were, I think, one of the poorest groups in the Afghan society then, which was the Deobandi ulama and their network, primarily in southern Afghanistan, but they had influences in other parts of Afghanistan. And we know the Taliban didn't invite bin Laden, but they inherited bin Laden because he went to this. And the Taliban created an additional problem for Pashtuns, which is that Pashtuns were not now seen as somehow were imagined as the Taliban, or the Taliban were imagined as this archetype Pashtuns. In fact, the Taliban are a very small minority of the Pashtuns. Since 2001, the Taliban have won. I mean, there are some Taliban who have reconciled with the government. Very few of them have won in the elections. Even today, if there is a genuine election in Afghanistan, I'm sure they cannot win beyond a few % of the vote. But it's this war, this complicated conflict formation in Afghanistan and Pakistan that sustains them. And they didn't act as a lot of people. There is a big myth about the Taliban, which is, I think, now gradually going away, which is that they were a nationalist movement. The Taliban were never a nationalist movement in the sense that they were not tied strictly to national interest. They were always motivated by what they thought was the Islamic interest, or what Islam taught them, or in their view, what the true Islamic spirit is. And this is what, if you read their literature, they use it in every single statement, that we are doing it in the name of Islam. They were accused of, ironically, as being Pashtun nationalists, but the Taliban never owned that claim. They sometimes will say that, well, I mean, part of the country is at a disadvantage or is not as privileged as other parts of Afghanistan or other groups, but they will never own this claim that they are fighting only for the Pashtuns. So after 9/11, you know the history, that how bin Laden was in Afghanistan and then he used Afghanistan to attack. 9/11 happened, and then there was this US-led attacks in Afghanistan that led to the demise of the Taliban by late 2001. But what is not known is that after 9/11, and what is not debated, there was a precious chance of resolving the conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Taliban were defeated. The new Afghan government was, under Karzai, was a coalition of different parties, factions who had mostly fought each other for the past many, many years. But I think Afghan society, by and large, I'm speaking from first-hand experience, that they were by and large ready to engage in some kind of a solution with Pakistan. There was this great hope in 2002, 2003, even 2004, when Afghanistan got its constitution after the Loyager and all that, that things will be okay. But in the meantime, because of what we talked about, because of the Durand Line and all these issues surrounding this, Pakistan was also playing, in a way, a double game, because it was keeping the Taliban alive in these places, Quetta, everywhere. I mean, their regime crumbled, but the movement stayed together. And by 2003, they launched an insurgency, and today they control, by any estimate, between 20 to 30% of the rural countryside. They don't control any major cities or highways, but they are capable of, and maybe this summer will decide this. So again, the Pashtun question was not addressed. It should have been addressed. Instead of absorbing the tribal areas in Pakistan, Pakistan went for giving them, first Pakistan at least turned a blind eye to Al-Qaeda's retreat into the tribal areas, to these regions after 9/11. And when they were pressured by the Washington, they did the absolutely wrong thing of just relying on military power to go after Al-Qaeda. They engaged, since 9/11, since 2003, late 2003 and then 2004, there are 7 districts in tribal areas from here to here, and they have engaged in at least 10, 12 major operations, one of which is going on called Zarb-e-Azab in North Waziristan, somewhere here. And every single tribe, the Turis, the Orakzais, the Shinwaris, everyone has endured great hardship. Thousands of people, at least 60,000 people, Pakistanis have died since. Most of them are Pashtuns, particularly from tribal area. There are at least 1 million people from Farah still displaced. But Pakistan has not tried to address this. And this is even true after the 2014 school massacre in Peshawar. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the story that in 2014, the Pakistani version of the Taliban claimed this massacre in the school where 140 students and teachers, nearly 150 were killed in a school, army school called Army Public School in Peshawar. And then Pakistan came up with this famous anti-terrorism policy called the National Action Plan. The plan had 20 points, ranging from the need to address the issue of extremism, to dialogue, to military action, to military courts for speedy trial of militants and stuff. And they have not truly implemented, and of course, reforms in tribal areas, they have not truly implemented one. The only one that they have made some progress on is this issue of hanging terrorism. So they have hanged a lot of terrorists, particularly those involved in attacking the military, but they have not delivered this kind of decisive defeat to terrorism in Pakistan that they wanted. And the reason is, again, this complicated interrelationship between, or a lack of relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So in this whole 9-10 years, one of the big mistakes on part of the Western powers, and I want to be very clear about it, is been that they focused mostly on addressing the military side, So they typically went after Al-Qaeda. They created Guantanamo Bay prison. They killed and captured, which is the term that a lot of militaries use, a lot of insurgent terrorists, etc. They used drones, etc. But they did not do much to address these relationships. It was only in 2009 when Obama announced his new policy, he came up with this policy for Afghanistan and Pakistan, that he emphasized the need for dialogue between the Taliban and Afghan government, and the need for reconciliation among Afghans, and also regional cooperation was. But again, there was no clear roadmap. And then if there was a clear roadmap, they didn't put enough diplomatic weight and military weight behind it to implement it. So by 2014, that's the time when I published my book. It came out in early 2014. It was kind of a stalemate. Because you have the Afghan government that's Western supported, that has on paper 300,000 soldiers and policemen. You have Pakistan, which is now cooperating with Afghanistan, or is trying or is claiming to, but you don't. The basics of the conflicts have not been addressed. The conflict is there, and in this scenario, since 2010, we have a new player. What I have argued in my book is kind of the solution, which is a regional cooperation solution. And you can imagine how things move very rapidly in this region. That when I was writing my book, of course, China was the biggest single foreign investor in Afghanistan, particularly in mining sector. But even then, the Chinese role was not that prominent. And since then, the Chinese have come out with this thing called One Belt, One Road. It is their vision of pretty much the future of the world. They have already earmarked close to $250 billion. They, as you can see, they want to connect China through Central Asia and Russia to Europe, and then they want to connect China, or Western China particularly, through Pakistan. And all of this will ultimately benefit Afghanistan. There is, of course, some projects that will ultimately go through Afghanistan, or they have not said that they will not make investment in Afghanistan. But I think right now this is the silver lining. And the Chinese, as the NATO was leaving Afghanistan, preparing to leave Afghanistan in 2014, the Chinese, for the first time, and if people know China, they're not very active, they're not very keen on being seen as very active in these kinds of conflicts. They appointed a very senior diplomat as their first Afghan-Pakistan representative. He's now been succeeded by someone else. But the whole Chinese idea is that by investing a lot of money, like for example, they are investing $46 billion in energy infrastructure projects in Pakistan in something called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. They think that this is the future. We need to stabilize this neighborhood, because if you look at Chinese society, it has changed. It's a remarkable story. It was a predominantly peasant society when the first Afghan war was happening in 1980s, but now China is the world's factory today. So the world factory cannot sustain its economic growth and security without developing its neighborhood. And luckily, Afghanistan hopefully will be one of the main beneficiary of this. So the Chinese are now, right now, in some ways, the moving spirit with a lot of help from United States and European powers in this initiative to somehow end this conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So one way of ending this conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan is for both countries to somehow resolve this issue of Durand line. They're both countries, they both recognize each other, they have diplomatic missions and embassies, they talk, they have a lot of trade agreements and stuff. They can build on this and maybe one day address this issue, which is of course, but there is another model which people are now talking about. My friend Barney Rubin has written about it, which is that China has a very major conflict with Taiwan. China doesn't recognize Taiwan as an independent country because there's a famous Chinese, they don't recognize two Chinas, there's one China. But Taiwan is China's biggest economic partner. So maybe that can be one model, alternative model for Pakistan and Afghanistan. Forget about the political things. Focus the economy. You have rising poverty. You have rising unemployment. You have rising population explosion. Imagine if a country, a break of a country like Syria with 20, 25 million people or something like that, and Afghanistan with 30 million people, instability or poverty in Afghanistan can deliver prompt 1 million people to come to Europe. If Pakistan, something happens in Pakistan, how many refugees there will be? What kind of instability? It will affect the whole region. So this is, for now, is a good map, a good way forward. And I want to end by saying a few things. I will show you some of these photographs that are also in my book. This is, of course, Kabul. This is Dir in Pakistan, northwest Pakistan. This is Quetta, southwestern Pakistan, one of major Pashtun city. This was somebody I interviewed in 2004 in Jalalabad, and her son has disappeared. And I mean, one of these stories that you hear, I mean, thousands and thousands of missing or disappeared, victims of enforced disappearances, both in Afghanistan, Pakistan, various regimes, militant groups, Pashtun music, rabab and stuff. Kandahar, this is the mausoleum of an Afghan emperor, Mirwais Hutak, in some ways the founder of modern Afghanistan because he rebelled against the Iranian rule of Kandahar. And this is a Pashtun nomad woman. This is a Pashtun tribal jirga, and if you pay enough attention, there is a Sikh guy here, and there is also, you can recognize by turban, a Sikh guy there. These are Afridi tribesmen in a place called Bara, near Khyber Agency, and they are debating something, and the minorities, religious minorities, are also involved. They are not discriminated against. So one reason I wrote about my people was to do away with these myths and stereotypes, and in a way clear the deck for constructive debate about the way forward. Thank you.